Hello, I'm back. I recorded a load of videos over a couple of days and then was uploading them bit by bit. And I'm going to record a load more today because I'm waiting on some feedback on some work. So I thought I'd blast through some of the stuff. I'm going to do a slightly different thing now. I'm going to basically take a couple of terms that I think people sometimes get confused about, or like that it's sort of the way the software and hardware is designed makes them slightly more complicated than they need to be. So these aren't considered to be scientific videos. They're not demonstrations of the maths or the sort of engineering that goes behind it. But again, I'm just trying to do these videos in sort of like your mate talking to you in the pub, explaining how stuff works in a way that's sort of friendly and non-specific, to try and help you get an understanding of this. So the topic or the sort of glossary term that I want to cover today is saturation. What that means, what saturation plugins do, and where the term comes from. There are some really good videos on this that I would really recommend watching. There's a guy who did 3 videos, sort of going through the maths and stuff and showing the wave shaping and stuff in detail that I'm not going to go into because he's probably done it better than anybody else has done on YouTube. But I'm going to talk to you about the history of the term and why we use it and what generally we mean. So the term saturation actually comes from analog audio and it comes from magnetic media. So anything that uses transformers and therefore usually valves or tubes if you're in America, and then things like magnetic tape, whether it's reel-to-reel tape or cassette. We use the word saturation because in the electromagnetic world, you can actually measure saturation as in how many, essentially, how much energy you can get from one side of something to another. And the saturation point is where it stops to be able to receive any more. So in the say tape, for example, you've got tape head. You're creating an electromagnetic force around that, and that force has a certain power behind it. And that power, at some point, will begin to saturate the tape. It's a little bit like if you did this at school, where you do that in chemistry, where you get like a glass of water and you fill it full of salt, and it's salt water, but then at a certain point, it becomes salt water and salt, and we call that saturated, as in it can't take any more. In magnetic media, the saturation curve is not basically like on and off. With digital, we have this thing where you have full scale. So we say dBFS, 0 dBFS is the highest amplitude you can get. Whereas with analog media and also analog equipment, say for example, overdriving the input or output of a mic preamp or a compressor or EQ or something like that, it's not as linear. It's not. It eventually will stop and just conk out, but there's several stages it gets to, and those stages are also not linear as far as frequency content goes. So you get these different sounds based on how you overdrive stuff, and that's a big part of guitar amps, for example, is how you overdrive stuff, what's the stages you put between stuff, and how you affect that. With digital, it's basically once you've gone over, you've gone over. You can't reconstruct any more bits, so you get the flat line, and we call that clipping. And if we're talking about processing, we call that hard clipping because it's clipping where nothing can go further over the point. Generally, what we mean when we talk about saturation in plugin form and in production is something that should probably really be called wave shaping, or it's at least wave shaping plus clipping. A good example of a plugin which does this is something like the Sonox Inflator, which is basically a wave shaper where you can change the shape of how it's changing that transfer curve. Again, terms like transfer, we use that because it's like the transfer curve would have in the past with analog technologies been the transfer between a magnetic head and a tape, for example, or between two sides of a transformer, which is an electromagnetic device which I actually studied at university. I'm not a particularly scientific guy, but I did do my dissertation or thesis in America on the use of transformers, balancing transformers, and the saturation idea is a big part of that. Now, in software, when we get a saturation plugin, what it really is a designed soft clip. So it's a soft clip with a certain range or certain characteristic or certain curve that someone has designed with an interface for a particular reason, which is sometimes why you'll find saturators or soft clippers, say for example Newfangled Saturate or the standard clip by SIR, actually has a range between perfectly linear, as in what you get in is what you get out, and hard clipped, and between that you get this what we think of as like an S shape, sinusoid sort of shape, which you would often see as saturation. So really, what we're talking about in plugins are two different types of things. There's saturation, that is basically just a straight digital wave shaper. It doesn't have anything else special under the hood as far as I know, but it's designed in a certain way, and then sort of things like the oversampling and sort of the way that the gain structure is coded within the plugin is different. So yeah, Newfangled Saturate's a good example of one of those. Oxford Inflator. I've been messing about with something called Pymax, which is a sort of inflator plus extra stuff that someone sort of homebrewed. Yeah, the standard clip, and also TC Electronic have their famous soft clip, which I use quite a lot. Very clean, but not quite so brutal sounding sort of soft clipper. The other side of it is you get saturators which have analog modeled characteristics, and they're usually things like tape emulations, transformer preamp emulations. A really good example of that is something like Kelvin by Tone Projects, which I really like. Really good way of getting the characteristics of, say, for example, the master output of a mixing console or a recorder like a studio recorder or Revox or whatever sort of classic sound you're going for. And essentially what they're doing is the same thing, but they're doing it with some more design behind the hood, which is tonally effective. One of the things that, once you understand saturation, the next sort of thing to go on to is this idea of hysteresis or hysteresis, depending on if you're American or not. And this is this idea of almost like a memory, and it's a lot easier to show in a diagram to explain what it is, but it's the idea of how long it takes to get from one side of the transfer curve to the other, and how that affects the frequency content. And you get these sort of graphs, just Google it, hysteresis plot, where you get this essentially feedback going round in a loop between the two sides of the transformer or the tape bed. And that affects a lot the dynamic content, especially of things like transients. So a lot of tape emulations will have this sort of thing built in. So you'll often find that these sort of saturators have much more of an inbuilt tone. They're a bit more specific sounding, whereas the sort of wave shaper, soft clipper type plugins are more designed really just to shift harmonic content. And what they do, really, the way to understand soft clippers and saturators is you trade off headroom for harmonic distortion. So you can change the levels going into, say, for example, a limiter, or going up to your recorder or your top of your headroom. But you're doing it in a way that you increase some distortion. Now, how you design that distortion and how you hide it or use it to almost like an EQ to add harmonics to an area while reducing the headroom is a big part of the sort of trick of saturating and soft clipping in mastering. So some famous ones, yeah, the soft clipper and the TC Electronic stuff. It's quite famous for being a good way to reduce level without using any limiting at all if you want to. So for example, acoustic stuff where, occasional compression limiting on the vocal or whatever is just not sounding natural. You can use a soft clipper to reduce the level so you can go higher up in digital. And also things like classic converters will have these soft clippers built in sometimes, like the Lavery Gold has a soft clipper stage and then it has a sort of overdrive beyond that, and then people have designed their entire transfer path around that sort of thing. And also like Prism have the overkillers, which I think are like a passive soft clipper circuit. So it's everywhere really. It's like once you understand limiting and you've got an idea of digital headroom, it's the next stage to get your head round. And a combination of soft, hard clipping and limiting and compression is usually how you achieve changes in headroom. So peak loudness is what I'm talking about really. How you get your levels from your little spiky jagged waveform into something that's got a hot level but still sounds good. So anyway, that's saturation, aka wave shaping, aka soft clipping, sometimes just called distortion, or people will sometimes see like warmth and stuff like that. But really, scientifically, we're talking about in digital, it's clipping, soft clipping, hard clipping, wave shaping, the actual signal itself, which is a slightly more detailed topic, but just the standard sinusoid wave shape with a clip at the top is generally the sort of thing we're talking about. And then in analog, we're talking about magnetic media mostly for saturation, because we're talking about going from one piece of equipment to another, and that transfer between the two. Anyway, hope this is useful. I'm going to do a few more little chats about some terms that I think are useful for demystifying and just explaining. If you have any ideas for anything you want explaining, just let me know. I will just rant about them like I have done now. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.